But I believe that by overwhelming majority in all the Americas, you and I, in the long run, and if it be necessary, you and I will act together to protect, to defend, by every means at our command.
Welcome to the History in Motion podcast, where we discuss leaders, their decisions, and how they shape the world we live in today.
In this episode of the History in Motion podcast, we journey through the early life and ascending career of Julius Caesar, stopping at the brink of his monumental decision to cross the Rubicon. From his youthful ambitions in the heart of Rome to the cusp of creating an empire, we trace the steps that led Caesar's emergence as a central figure in history. We delve into Caesar's rise through the Roman political ranks, his strategic alliances, and his transformative reforms that challenged the Republic's norms. Highlighting key battles and political maneuvers, we reveal how Caesar's genius in warfare and politics propelled him to unparalleled heights. This episode also explores the complexity of Caesar's character, his relentless pursuit of power, balanced with a vision for Rome's greatness. As we approach the moment he stood before the Rubicon, we dissect the motivations and pressures that guided his fateful choice. Join us as we explore Julius Caesar's journey to the edge of destiny, uncovering the events that led to a turning point in Roman history. This is the story of ambition, power, and the making of an empire, up until the moment that everything changed.
Welcome back, everyone, to the History in Motion podcast. And Ritchie, today's the big one, the one I think we've all been looking forward to, the one that I think everybody knows about. And coincidentally, we are recording this on the Ides of March. So I think it is quite fitting to be talking about Julius Caesar today. And just to kind of set the stage for this, his life is far too long and far too interesting to do in one episode. So we are going to split this one out into two, where today we're going to talk about his rise to power, his Gallic campaigns, and everything that he kind of does to get himself into a position where he crosses the Rubicon. And that's where we're going to end it off. And then next time we're going to talk about the civil war that comes about based on that decision, and then the infamous Et tu, Brute assassination of Julius Caesar that we all know from Shakespeare and all the other references to that throughout literature and whatnot. So a lot to pack in today. It's going to be really interesting, but I think he's, again, like we talked about last week, there's a reason we kind of started with Alexander and now we're moving into Caesar, and we're going to continue along this ancient course of great men and women who've really changed the world, but also when we look back at this time period, these are some of the names that always rise to the top.
Yeah, I think there's a reason that like the cultural legacy and the pop culture references, like even going back to, Alexander or some of the other episodes that we've done, there is just something that still, I think as a modern culture, we're still beholden to, this kind of rise to power, the ambition, the political maneuvering. Like it's almost like a drama in many ways when you're doing research. And I sometimes find myself almost having to like gut check that no, this actually happened. It is a real story, and these are real people we're talking about. And sometimes with the narrative style of discussion that we do, it almost leads it to kind of sound like a dramatization. But obviously we try our best to be like historically factual as possible. But yeah, these stories are just incredible.
And this is, I think, the first one that it's very clearly a factual story, whereas Alexander, there was a bit of that myth and fanfare and son of Zeus and that kind of stuff. Where with Caesar, it's very clearly it doesn't really toe the line between mythology and reality. There's definitely some fanfare and there's people talking about certain things in a more grandiose way than they actually happened to kind of suit the narrative that, again, we've talked about a million times. All these great leaders have good PR in some capacity. So, with Caesar, it's all kind of grounded within reality, it sounds like. It doesn't really, toe the line between myth and legend. It's more kind of all together, but then in itself becomes its own legend on top of that. But exactly. You're right. This story is, again, almost so, it kind of reads like a literature or a fiction. And from that perspective, sometimes, we almost have to take a step back and remind yourself, like, this is an actual real story that actually happened. And it's not just, something somebody created one day. This is all like a real thing from a real person.
Yeah, 100%. I think this is one of those, like the idea of like an epic saga almost comes to mind when we're talking about, this time period in history. I think we were talking offline and I mentioned, for myself, when I'm doing this research, it's not a strong suit of mine. And that's always interesting to kind of do a deep dive because there is this element of it being so far removed that it almost does feel like this kind of epic story. But, in reality, this is historically documented. And, how many biographies of Julius Caesar have been written, or how often has he been talked about when it comes to, ancient Rome?
And I think too, just with you said it's so far removed. And then we have 700-800 years after the fall of the Roman Empire, where we have at least from certain parts of Europe, we don't have as strong of a historical basis to go off of, just because, we're kind of living through these dark ages. So it almost seems like all this crazy stuff happens. Then you have this bit of a black hole, or maybe a gray hole is a better way of saying there's some stuff there, but not as rich. And then the Renaissance happens and we're back to kind of Roman level historical knowledge. And I think that's kind of what makes it seem so distant, is that you almost have this lull. It's not a slow build up from there to where we are today. It's you're high, then you dipped for a bit, and now you're kind of back up. So I think there's a lot to kind of talk about when it comes to that, because it is such a rich period in time. So to start us off today, it's important to understand what Rome is, what the Roman Republic really stands for, because when we talk about Julius Caesar, we know him as a dictator. We know him as the person who basically destroys the Roman Republic. And then people start to ask, did Caesar just show up one day and just steamroll the Republic? Or is there a little bit more going on here? And was the seeds already set to kind of break that down? And why was he even able to do that if Rome had such a strong Republican tradition? So that's what we're going to start today. So when we look at Rome, we have to go all the way back to the beginning, where Rome was founded as a kingdom in 753 BC, where it was ruled by kings until the last king was overthrown and Rome became a republic in 509 BC. So the thing with the Romans to remember is they despise kings, because their whole history is built on, we had these kings who didn't care about the people, who didn't care about the common man, who didn't care about anybody else but themselves, and will never ever go back to that. So they built a republic, and the republic was ruled by a senate which was ruled by a group of Rome's elite men, but it was also counterbalanced by the People's Assembly, where the common people had the ability to dictate laws and administration of the state. It really wasn't a democracy in the way maybe the Athenians would have looked at it, but it did have some level of voting and democratic elements to it. But at the end of the day, the senators were from elite and noble families, and it was very difficult for a pleb, which was just a regular Joe, to kind of make his way up into that senatorial elite. But the senators would also have elections. People's Assembly would also vote as well. But to say it was fair and open elections is a big stretch. Bribes were very common, and they were kind of not punished in the same way we would today. People would turn a blind eye to them. But at the end of the day, you still had to be able to get the common man and the senators on board if you really wanted to be a successful leader. So, it all kind of comes together into, what the Senate is trying to build and how the people have involvement. But the most important thing is they don't have that singular leader. They don't have a king. They don't have an emperor. They don't have some sort of monarch who has this hereditary right, for lack of a better term, to be in power. You actually have to earn your way to the top, which sounds great in practice, and it does work well for very long, but we'll get into at some point that starts to break down as Rome becomes bigger and bigger and more powerful, because at this time, they're only a small, essentially city-state in the Roman area of Italy, and they start to expand from there. But when they start becoming this massive empire that controls the entire Mediterranean, it gets a little bit more tricky to have this more quote unquote Republican system that they've known for so many years.
It's interesting, right? Like, I feel like if I clipped the last minute of you speaking, many of those sentiments, including the bribery and the unfairness in politics, or almost like this case study in empire building, still hold true for so many of the other episodes that we've talked about. It's like a tried and true story about empire building, overstretching your resources, and, at some point, something has to give. And I think for me, when we do this podcast, this is one of those things that I'm always so intrigued by. Like, there's so many light bulb moments to see how many examples across this very vast historical timeline still can be relevant and comparable to, things that we discussed that happen in the modern era or, in the mid era.
It's a perfect way to describe why almost it was created and why it worked for so long, because the parallels you're mentioning, one of the big things that I kind of came away with is it's a way to temper ambition a little bit. You need to kind of have the balance between the two. You can't have a total autocratic society where one or two people have supreme control and there's no way for anybody who has some sort of ambition to work their way up to the top. But then you also can't just have a free for all where it's almost like, survival of the fittest, or whoever's the strongest can rise their way to the top. And I think the Romans have found a pretty nice balance here, because you can be a regular person and join the military and really work your way up, build a name for yourself. You may never get to the level of a senator or a noble family, but you've set your family up to a higher level. You maybe do some strategic marriages, and eventually, after a few generations, your family may become one of these more elite families. But at the same time, it's not, sorry, you weren't born into an elite family, you have zero chance of ever making it up. It's definitely difficult, but you can make it up to the top. So something that the Romans did here was they had almost like just kind of a ladder that you needed to climb. Like, think of almost like the corporate ladder. Like, you got to come in as an individual contributor, and then you're a manager, and then you work your way up to president or vice president. They kind of had something similar to that. So they called it the cursus honorum. And I kind of, like I said, I think it's a really good way to say, okay, you're an ambitious person. You have to pay your dues. And if you pay your dues, you will get to that ultimate supreme kind of level, which was a consul. So the Romans had 2 consuls every year who were elected by the Senate and the People's Tribune. But the most important thing is there was 2 of them, and they were only in power for 1 year. So the one consul could be overruled by the other. So no one ever had supreme power and could just overrule the whole Senate or the other consul. They always had to kind of work together and make sure that they were holding each other in check. However, the Romans weren't silly. They realized that sometimes you do need that supreme commander. And this was when they were in moments of crisis, they would appoint a dictator. And that dictator is like the term we use today. Ultimate supreme power. You can do whatever you want, but it's only in emergencies. And so think of the time when Hannibal was wreaking havoc through Italy. The Romans would put in these dictators who would come in for 6 months, do what they needed to do, get things back on track. But then their expectation was they would always give the army back to the Senate, or they would step down and say, okay, I've done my time. I'm going to go back to doing what I need to do. Let's elect a new consul for next year, and let's get on with this. And, we talked about George Washington all those weeks ago. And one of the things we talked about is he gave back his army. He gave it back to Congress. And this is kind of what typically, like, he was, I guess, a Roman dictator in the same sense. He had supreme power for this crisis. But then when he was done, he relinquished the army and went back to living, a normal life, and then became president through the electoral process. So that's kind of where they're trying to get to. And we'll get into kind of the roles in a bit. But I think, Ritchie, the important part to really hammer home here is that there's a way to kind of get up to this top level. But there is these small times when a supreme leader / dictator can come into power. But if they don't give back control of the army, it's not going to make a lot of people happy. And if you're slightly more ambitious than the Romans have prepared for, you might start to take advantage of that dictator status.
Yeah, it's an interesting kind of like check and balance, right? And I can see the merit in the approach, because sometimes you need someone at the helm who is a capable strategist and leader to kind of get you through a dark or tenuous period. The caveat being that, it's the presumption is that, once you are through that period of struggle or, warfare or whatever, situation you're in, is that you relinquish control. And I think if we've learned anything doing this podcast so far, is that sometimes it's very difficult for people to relinquish that power or control.
Yeah, especially when you have this ambition that's at a all the people we talk about have ambition that's,
100%.
one in a million or something like that. So yeah, if you put someone in that position and they're not willing to temper it, you are going to run into some challenges. So before we get into Caesar's life, I'm just going to go over a few of the roles that a typical Roman would have to go through before they had a chance to get to becoming a consul. So this is, like I mentioned, the cursus honorum, which is that ladder that Romans would have to climb. And it starts out with joining the military. So you need to have 10 years experience as a military tribune within the army. So we've talked about it many times with the Romans. Military tradition is everything. If you don't have any military experience, you're not going to have many legs to stand on. So that was always kind of that first piece. The next was a financial administration position called a quaestor. And the interesting thing about this is the Romans said you have to be at least 30 years old to do this. So even if you've done your military service, they're starting to look at it saying, you need to have a lot of experience with life before you can start managing things financially. We're not going to give a 19-year-old access to the treasury because, quite frankly, you haven't gone through that process, and also we want you to have the right experience. And this continues on. So the next level up is you need to be 36 years old and you can manage public works and festivals. When you become 39, you can start commanding armies, departments of the governments, and you can actually be a judge within the Republic. And then that's finally capped off by the consulship. So you have to be 42 years old at a minimum and have done all of these different steps before you can even be considered for a consul. And the thing with consuls too is it was very, very rare for people to be a consul more than 3 times in their lifetime. I believe there's a limit between times you can be consuls. I believe it's 10 years. And so it's very much an expectation of you come in, you do your duty, and then you step back into the Senate or you step back into another role where you're still influential, or you go manage a province where you have a little bit of an opportunity to gain some wealth and some money as well. But your whole responsibility is to the Republic. And then when your time is up, you step down or you kind of pay your dues. And I think the thing that's most important about all of this, it serves the ambition, but it also makes it part of public service. So they're always giving back something to the Republic. And so in this sense, it's not, hey, I'm really ambitious and I'm just going to maybe start a business, make myself a lot of money, but nothing goes back to the state. In this case, there's always something where you're giving back to the people. And I think that's kind of maybe the romanticization a bit of the Republic, of just this collective where everybody's working really well together. But again, as we start to see, and you can, as the listeners are listening, you can probably start to see where there's a few gaps in there and a few cracks that are starting to form where, what if someone wants to be a quaestor at the age of 25 and they have a lot of military power? Are you going to go to war with this person because they want to do something earlier than, maybe they're supposed to? So there's a lot of that. And there's a lot of just social contracts that people can break at any time, not necessarily hard laws. So yeah, there's a little bit here, but again, this lasted for over 500 years. So it definitely worked for a very long time, almost broke many times, but it stayed together basically all the way up to Julius Caesar's decision to cross the Rubicon.
It's so funny that you brought the word romanticize, because as I was listening to you speak, I was totally romanticizing it in my head. Like I will be totally honest. I was like, wow, it sounds so great. This sense of like civic duty. And you probably learn a lot about me in that way, because I tend to think that like, that kind of civic responsibility, civic duty, this way of kind of doing things in this very architected, structured way, it really speaks to me. But to your point, Paul, there's always something underneath the covers that is lurking, as we'll see.
For sure, yeah, it's definitely not as straightforward. It looks great on paper, but yeah, there's always somebody trying to game the system and always somebody trying to get ahead of their fellow man, because that's just general human ambition and rise to the top in hierarchical structures. So that's Rome. That's the Republic that Julius Caesar's born into. So I think, Ritchie, it's probably a good idea now we can bring him onto the scene, and then there'll be a few steps along his life where we'll talk a little bit where we can see him being involved in maybe some of the precursors to the fracturing of the Republic that we just described before he really kind of puts that final nail in the coffin.
Perfect. Yeah. So kicking off with a bit of his bio. So, obviously, since we're talking about Julius Caesar, he is obviously one of the most eminent figures in history. He was born into a patrician family, which essentially, Paul, it seems like really reflects on this wealthy landowner status to the Julii family. He was born in July of 100 BC in Rome. So even despite this kind of patrician status of his family, it seems like they were kind of in this stagnated status almost. So, even though they had some wealth and had some historical, like political legacy and, power, it seems like during his early life, they were kind of, politically stagnant. They weren't really the movers and shakers of any meaning at this point in time. But apparently the family did claim they were the descendants of the goddess Venus, which gave them a certain prestigious standing in Roman society. So maybe there is a bit of mythology there. I don't think with the same degree as Alexander, but you kind of see this kind of traditional and ceremonial aspect of it.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's not that same level, even close to Alexander, but the Romans are very, very superstitious. They're very similar to the Greeks in the sense of how they think about gods and favor with the gods and that kind of stuff, but maybe to a little bit of a lesser degree at this point. But again, being able to say you are a descendant of a god, it's great propaganda and it's great PR, 100%. Especially to this, very superstitious Romans.
Yeah, I wish I could say that, but it doesn't. I don't think I can trace it back into my lineage. If we're looking at his familial relationship, so when I was doing my research, a lot of his biographical kind of information started with his familial relationships, which is a bit interesting because usually it comes a little bit later. typically in the research, but I thought it would be a good starting point. And interestingly enough, most of the research started with the women in his life who played a very significant role in shaping his personal and political trajectory. The two most notable are his mother Aurelia and his aunt Julia. So his mom, his mother Aurelia, she belonged to the Aurelia family, which was of consular status. So I guess, Paul, to your point, it's like the kind of highest elected public official ranking that you could have. So her lineage kind of provided Caesar with this additional layer of patrician status, which is kind of crucial in this hierarchical and status conscious society that he's growing up in. She's often kind of depicted as a woman of like strict integrity and stoicism. She embodies these traditional Roman matron virtues. She played a significant role in his upbringing, especially given like the political turbulence of his youth with the social war and Sulla's dictatorship, which we'll talk about, that kind of marked his early years. So there's not much actual historical detail about their like personal interactions, which kind of makes sense given how far back we're talking, but she's credited for having a profound influence on his development, morally, intellectually. And also when his second wife, Pompeia, was implicated in a sacrilegious act, Aurelia was involved in kind of managing the household's integrity. And I think, like, as we'll see, she really kind of underscores her role, not just as his mother, but as this kind of protector of the family's honor.
Yeah, I think that's very common within Roman society, right? We don't see women having the agency within the Senate or within public office. But when it comes to, these elite families and how they interact, the women have a very key role in that, not just on raising the sons who are going to be entering these offices, but also helping with marriages, helping do some of those backdoor deals, because again, these are very capable women who just don't have the agency. And again, we talked about the men climbing through these ladders. There's definitely women who have some level of ambition as well. And sometimes it's kind of led through their kids and through their family. And like, how can I bring my family up to the next level? So I think for someone like Caesar, and we see it a lot with a lot of great Romans, they all have strong women around them in some capacity. And so I think that just kind of how you were describing the women around Julius Caesar is, he's got what's kind of needed from, a young age and kind of those very influential years from a more maternal standpoint. And then as he kind of grows more into the maybe a more military leader and that kind of stuff, he kind of brings more of maybe the masculine side of things into it. And he's able to rise up those ranks and kind of grow his family and, do all the things that he is able to do.
And I think to your point, right, like, about that ambition, either which is realized like through marriage or children, his aunt Julia seems like a perfect example of that. So his aunt by blood was married to Gaius Marius, one of Rome's most celebrated military generals and a 7-time consul. This connection significantly influenced Caesar's early political alignments and aspirations. Marius was a leader of the Popularis, a political faction that championed the cause of Rome's common citizens against the aristocratic elite. Her marriage to Marius connected Caesar to one of the most powerful figures in Roman politics and the champion of this kind of populist faction. So you can kind of see here, right? Like, to your point, these women, through their familial and political connections, provided Caesar with a very powerful social and political network. Their influence was both direct and indirect and really helped shape the early years of, one of history's most iconic figures.
Definitely. And, you mentioned Marius, and there was one little thing there that I just want to call out. You mentioned he was consul 7 times. So if you're doing the math and how I said before, you're only consul maybe 3 times in your life. There's usually about a 10-year gap. So again, he's growing up into this world where someone's consul 7 times. How does that make any sense, right? So I just want to bring that up because it's important to see how the cracks in the Republic are starting to form. And for Caesar, should be fantastic. He's within kind of the Marius circle of influence through a marriage, and he should be able to kind of use that as a springboard into whatever he's kind of working on. And we'll see how there's a few wrinklings to that. It's not so straightforward, but it's an important thing to remember because, he's got this relationship, but again, it's not, or I'm trying to say he's growing up into this world where even someone within his family is starting to bend the social norms and the rules a little bit because of their ambitions and what they're trying to achieve.
Yeah, 100%. It's such a great call out. And I think, I haven't talked about his father yet. And it seems like for the most part, he's largely absent from his life. And historically speaking, he had a bit of a low profile. He did hold the position of a praetor, which again is kind of this an office position in the Roman Republic that ranked below consul. It was a judicial office, and he was kind of responsible, or people in this position would be responsible for administering justice. So he would have had, some clout as a figure with some considerable respect and authority, but more or less it seems like any historical record doesn't really mention any notable achievements or events during his praetorship. And this kind of lack of a historical footprint, I would assume, like, it would be fair to say, he was obviously competent, but he did not really distinguish himself the same way that his son would in later years. And so just moving on from that, his father died in 85 BC. So this is when Julius Caesar was around 15 years old. So obviously, as a young person, this would have a profound impact on his life. It thrust him into the role of like head of the family at a relatively young age. And, I'm sure this earlier responsibility definitely contributed to his drive and ambitious nature that was already there. And we'll just talk quickly about his education. So again, his early life is set against the backdrop of a social war and the rise of Sulla, which highlighted this very tumultuous political period and civil strife within the Roman Republic. He receives, what could be considered a very standard education for a young Roman of his class, which included learning to read and write, the study of Greek and Latin languages, literature, and understanding of Roman law and public speaking. And he was known for his exceptional intellect and rhetorical skills from a very early age.
Yeah, it seems to me, kind of from what you're saying about his childhood, it just sounds like a lot of stability for a time where he's getting things kind of in a standard way. His father dying at 15, but being mostly absent. It's not like there's tragedy that he seems to be having to fight through, maybe in the same way we'd seen some other leaders. So he's not given this grandiose education or being groomed from a young age to be an eventual consul, but he's got the stability and he's able to kind of jump from that, and that continues on for a time. But I think you mentioned the turmoil with Sulla and the social war and that kind of stuff, so I think we should stop here and introduce the listeners to the Marius and Sulla, I guess we'll just call it the battle, right? Feud, whatever you want to call it, because these are two great men who have massive ambitions, who have done great things for the Republic, but now they're at each other's throats because they have kind of gone past the predefined plan that the Roman Republic offers to them, and they want more, and they want to continue moving forward, but it's going to have to come at the expense of the other. So just real quickly, you had mentioned about Marius and his relationship to Julius Caesar. His biggest thing that Marius did as consul was he had some really notable achievements against some tribes coming from northern Italy and into coming out of Switzerland who were attacking Italy, and he won some great victories against them. But one of the things that he did was he actually professionalized the army. And so what that means is before you would be working as a farmer, or you'd be working as a blacksmith, or whatever trade you were doing, you were owning land. That was the big thing. You owned some sort of land, and then Rome was in some sort of crisis, or they were going off to campaign and conquer new territory, and you would stop doing what you were doing as a blacksmith or farmer or whatever, and then you would go fight, and you would come back, and then go back to your normal job, and hopefully you've won some riches from your battles. And that was kind of the way it worked. And Marius realized very quickly that as Rome wants to expand, it's not going to be able to expand in the way it needs to and defend itself with this kind of citizen militia sort of setup. So what he did was he created a professional army, and that's typically like we have today, where you go join the army, you work as a person in the army, you are paid by the state to be a professional soldier. And so now this has created this massive apparatus, really this third kind of leg to the Roman society, where you had the Senate, the people, and now you have the military. And so it was great because the Roman army quickly started conquering new land, quickly was able to fend off any sort of invasion. However, now these armies were starting to become more loyal to their generals than they did to the state. And we'll see that when it comes to Julius Caesar. But then also Sulla comes onto the scene, who's a little bit younger than Marius, and he actually worked under Marius, and he came from a patrician family as well. And he had a rise to power through the military, which very typical. And he was, becoming a consul, and he was able to really rise in the ranks. But then what happens is Sulla's ready for his big break. There's a king in the east who's threatening Rome, and Sulla has the opportunity to lead that army and win great glory for Rome. However, Marius is a bit of an older guy now. He's in retirement, but he decides, no, I have one more campaign left in me. So he comes out of retirement, is able to work the political back rooms, and take control of this army. That was supposed to be Sulla's grand army he was going to take to the east and win great riches for Rome. And now it's been seized and given to Marius. And Sulla, instead of saying, all right, that's the will of the Senate, I will do what's asked of me and I will relinquish this army. He is the first to actually turn around and march on Rome with his army and take the city in, I guess, what you would call some sort of civil war. So Sulla comes into Rome, and him and Marius's supporters have this massive, essentially, fight. There's, political hangings, and there's basically lists posted of here's all the people that need to be brought in front of Sulla because they're friends of Marius. They need to be executed. And it's just a bloody, awful time for the Republic. And eventually what happens is Sulla becomes dictator, claims that he's going to be dictator for life. So he makes all of these reforms to try to he claims he's trying to save the Republic. And eventually, though, in his credit, at the end of this time, he says, okay, I'm no longer the dictator. I will give everything back to the people and to the Senate, and I will go retire peacefully. And that's what happens. So in a sense, sure, he made some changes and he got people back to thinking, hey, the Republic is back to what it needs to be. But the main thing is he's now set this precedent that you can march on Rome and you can be successful at it. You can keep your head, people are going to start asking questions and start thinking. And so this whole kind of craziness, I guess, for lack of a better term, is happening while Julius Caesar is a young man. And he, like we talked about, is related to Marius through marriage. Sulla's not going to be too happy about that. So I'm sure we'll get into, he's now on the wrong side of a civil war, which will be kind of become a common theme amongst this time for Caesar and the people coming after him. But I know the seeds have now been set, and the precedent has now been set that you as a Roman can march onto Rome and take control if you really want to, because all you need to do is have the military behind you more so than the entire Senate and people and everything like that.
Yeah, that's such great context. And I think, to your point, this is kind of like a major turning point for Caesar. So with Sulla taking over as dictator for life, I always find that title hilarious. But so essentially with his affiliation with the Marian faction through marriage to Cornelia, he kind of becomes this defiant figure in Roman politics because he refuses to divorce her on Sulla's orders. But after Sulla returns to power and he continues to purge his enemies, I'm sure Caesar's name ended up on one of those lists somewhere because he finds himself in a very, very dangerous position. So he leaves Rome to avoid Sulla's prescriptions, a decision that essentially marked the beginning of his, latter military career. So he
it's a very classic Roman thing, right? There's someone who wants my head. I'll go off on campaign and, do some military stuff and then come back, because at the end of the day, if I can show success on the battlefield, it's going to win points no matter what. And that's just, I don't know, it just sounded like a very Roman thing to do from kind of everything we've talked about so far.
Well, I think the cultural, I know we try to talk about the culture and social aspect as much as we can, but obviously we kind of focus on the individual, more or less, just to scope out our discussions in a meaningful way. And I think for Rome, the military tradition is something that undercuts this entire episode. And we probably don't get into enough detail about it, for our listeners, but I think it's such an interesting pivot point because instead of running away to do nothing, he runs away to go fight in some campaigns in Asia Minor, where he serves his kind of first major military campaign. And this is kind of his first foray into military life where, in his late teens, and during this campaign, he's tasked with securing the assistance of a king to assemble the fleet against threat posed by Mithridates of Pontus, which was a formidable enemy of Rome. But there's an interesting thing that happens here. So I guess maybe before I go there, in terms of military experiences, just to kind of double down on this kind of military tradition, I think it's pivotal for several reasons. It allows him to develop his military skills. To your point, Paul, it builds his reputation. The awards and recognition he received, such as I think he received the Civic Crown, helped build his reputation as a brave and skilled leader. The political implications, so his military service, particularly with his associations with some of those key stakeholders, would be used by his political enemies to slander him later. But in the same vein, his military achievements also provided him with some credibility. So there is this, very nuanced result that's happening here. So he is able to align himself with some political enemies that, could backfire against him. But in the same vein, his military achievements also provide him with some additional credibility in the eyes of, the Roman Republic. And obviously the network expansion, it allowed him to, mingle, coordinate, socialize, and build meaningful relationships with other military men and politicians that would lay the groundwork for future alliances and his eventual rise to power.
For sure. And I think we talked about this when we've talked about previous Roman emperors. If you can control 2/3 of, I guess one of them needs to be the military, quite frankly, but for Julius Caesar, he's very much a populist. So he's going after what the people want, and he's going to have the military behind him. The Senate's hands don't become fully tied, but there definitely makes their influence on what he's trying to do a little bit more difficult. So
Sure.
like you said, like he now has the military behind him. He's won all these battles that he can point to, that the people are going to say, hey, this is a person who can lead us, who knows how to do it, who's got the experience and the track record and the awards and all these things to do it. Of course, we're going to back him. And then, add in all the propaganda and his ability to speak and the social changes that he makes. It's all about kind of bringing the people on board and kind of shouting the message of, he's going to be this great person, great leader, whatever it might be. It all comes back, like you said, to that military tradition, though. If he doesn't have that, he doesn't really have much of a leg to stand on, because then somebody who's a little bit stronger is just going to roll in with their army. It's like, great, you have the people on your side, but I got 50,000 legionnaires behind me who are ready to die for me. So it's that other piece, and I think it's good that we've kind of doubled down on it, because without it, he's just a footnote in history.
Exactly. Yeah, and such a good point. And I think this is one of actually like the more interesting stories that I came across that you told me to look into a bit. So this happens in 75 BC. So he's en route to Rhodes to further his education in rhetoric. So he's actually captured by Sicilian pirates near the island of Pharmacusa. So the pirates initially demand a ransom of 20 talents of silver, but Caesar insists that they ask for 50, claiming that they did not realize his value. And during his captivity, he maintains this kind of air of superiority, even threatening to crucify the pirates. So, and he kind of ends up treating like his capture more like a stay at a guest house. He's exercising, he's reading, he's even joining the pirates in their games and exercises. And after his ransom is paid and he's released, he raises the naval force. He pursues the pirates and captures them. And true to his word, he actually crucified them, but not before showing mercy by slitting their throats to spare them prolonged agony of crucifixion, which is a horrible, horrible way to go out.
I love this story for so many things. So on so many levels, it shows all the levels of Caesar. You have that cockiness of, you're only asking for 20. Are you guys nuts? Do you know who I am? He's got this aura around him and this, cockiness that he thinks he's so much better than everybody else. But then he has this playful side where he's able to win people over, to persuade them to kind of show that charm. And then he's got the ruthless side of, you're no use to me anymore. So you're pirates. You must be killed because piracy is illegal. And I told you I was going to crucify you. So there you go. But yeah, I'll slit your throats because I do have a little bit of mercy. And Caesar was known for, I'll give you one chance. And if you blow that chance, you're toast. And so maybe that was kind of his way of saying, hey, you could just release me, but, they still wanted ransom and stuff. He's like, all right, well, I told you I was going to do this. So here it comes. But it's a perfect story because it has all three elements to that. I'm sure there's some Caesar propaganda kind of mixed into that, but
sure, yeah.
I wouldn't doubt, like, if we took Caesar's entire life and put it into a nutshell, I think this story kind of wraps it up perfectly.
And I think it just goes to show some of like those really interesting personality traits that we see in other leaders that we've talked about. This very kind of like nuanced balance of like machismo, confidence, strategy, and it all kind of comes together in this story. It's quite perfect. And he's so level-headed. Like, how many of us could be captured by pirates and operate in this with this much confidence, not only escape, but then pursue them and, kill them afterward, while giving them more talents that they had initially asked for. Like, it's such an awesome story. So if we kind of jump from there, so after punishing the pirates, he returns to Rome. He is quickly immersed in the city's political life. His ambition, obviously he's a very ambitious guy, is to climb the Roman political ladder. So Paul, to your point from earlier in the conversation, this is where this kind of cursus honorum comes into play. And he gets his first significant political role as a military tribune, a position that offered him a glimpse into military command and the workings of the Roman army. And I don't want to go into too much detail because I feel like we could spend an hour just talking about his kind of rise up this, Roman Republic ladder. But he does have I think you used the word, and I'm probably going to butcher it because my Latin isn't very good, but was it quaestorship?
You got it. Well done.
Yes. So his quaestorship in Spain in 69 BC, he's elected. It took him into further Spain, which is modern day Andalusia and Portugal. And this was his first step in to the Roman political sphere, kind of provided him some very valuable administrative experience, and also gave him the opportunity to kind of showcase his leadership skills. After this, the next position in terms of like his, growth and moving up throughout the cursus honorum is the Pontifex Max, or chief high priest. So this allowed him to gain popularity among the Roman populace. He was able to organize lavish games and public works projects. He spent vast amounts of money to win public favor. So you kind of see like the PR, the populist ideal of, really trying to gain momentum and favor with, the broader populace outside of just the Roman elite. His election to Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome, was also this kind of significant religious and political achievement that further established his prominence kind of throughout the society as a whole.
And I think it's important to mention, as he's going through all of this, he's not necessarily doing it in the most legal way possible. There is, like we mentioned before, the bribes, the pushing of the social norms. Caesar's definitely pushing them to a degree that most senators aren't comfortable with. So he is able to accomplish a lot of things, and he is able to rise up those ranks. But as we'll see as we go along, all of these little backstabbing deals, or all of him kind of, saying that, hey, I'm going to do this and I don't really care what people think because, I'm Julius Caesar, or him trying to, cover his own butt in certain situations, it will come back to haunt him in some capacity. But I think it is kind of that darker side to, we see him doing all of these great things, but the way he's able to get to those positions isn't necessarily following the path that he's supposed to go along. But also at the same time, his response would be, well, the Senate is very corrupt anyways. It's all a bunch of oligarchs who control everything. I'm more capable, so why wouldn't you want me in control? And he's able to do a lot of great things, but you'll start to see as we go along that everything isn't always by the book.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point. And I think that's probably a caveat that we should, our listeners should probably be aware of. We're trying to pack as much information as we can within 1 hour. But, most of this is in terms of like the political maneuvering. I wonder, from the historical research that's been done, those are the things that are so difficult to pin down. How can you trace back any potential bribes that were made, or, backdoor maneuvers that led him to kind of get the power and a claim that he did?
And sometimes too, like everybody does it, but you just don't do it too much. That's the thing, right? Where's that line? It's weird. It's like, it's illegal technically, but we turn a blind eye up to a point, or up to a point where someone doesn't like you, so they're going to use it against you. And he kind of manages to do both of those. He manages to annoy enough people and go over the line in some areas, and then it becomes a bit of a perfect storm with him.
Yeah. So we'll fast forward a bit. So we'll go to his consulship in 59 BC and his subsequent campaigns in Gaul. So a lot of like what we're going to talk about next is kind of interwoven with each other. So you're talking about the campaigns in Gaul, his consulship, and then kind of this formation and functioning of the first triumvirate, which is comprised of Caesar, Pompey, and Marcus Crassus, which was this kind of strategic alliance, largely informal, designed to consolidate and expand the political powers of its members within the Roman Republic.
Yes, I think real quick, just on Crassus and Pompey, just so people know, who they are and why they're important. They will get their own episodes at some point because they have very interesting lives. But real quickly on Crassus and Pompey. So Crassus is actually considered to be maybe the most wealthy person in the history of the world. He's up there. He always kind of loses out to people would say, Augustus Caesar was the richest person of all time because he actually owned the province of Egypt personally, where Crassus is just a person who's got this massive empire of wealth. And one of the things that he did was Rome was always on fire. There was no proper fire brigade. So he would show up to people's houses that were on fire and with his slaves behind him who were ready to put out the fire, and offer to buy the house at a discounted price or to put out the fire, and basically say, okay, well, pay me or I'll just leave. And that was kind of one of his kind of ways that he was able to kind of grow a lot of wealth. And then he built his empire out of that. So he was very, very powerful economically, but didn't have the military experience that someone like Caesar will end up having, but also Pompey. And so Pompey he's won great victories in the East. He's expanded the empire. He is called Pompey the Great, and he really kind of deserves that term because he is we'd say more by the book person who's moved up the ranks, but he's also now getting to this point where he's accomplished so much, and he now is kind of seen as this opposition force against Caesar, but he's able, like you said, to join into this kind of triumvirate and three-way agreement between these three men, where they've also almost kind of created this little, oligarchy themselves that works within the system. And so he's really, really important to that, because he does have a lot of respect, and he's accomplished so much, and he's a little bit older. So he's that perfect ally for Caesar at this point, because he has that military experience, and then Crassus can bankroll them both, for many, many lives over. So they'll get their own episodes at some point, but just wanted to introduce, those those two guys, because they're really, really important to this entire story.
I think that's such great context, just to kind of take it home for how this alliance between these three powerhouses actually work. They all have something that the other needs, right? In many ways. So I think, that was such great context. Maybe just a couple points on Caesar's actual consulship. So it's really marked by a couple of efforts to implement a series of reforms aimed at addressing some of the social and economic issues facing Rome at the time, as well as securing benefits for his allies, some of those backdoor dealings that we've been kind of talking about. One of his key legislative achievements was land redistribution. So implementing the Lex Julia Agraria. So this is a redistribution of public land to the poor and veterans, aiming to alleviate poverty and social unrest caused by the concentration of land ownership within the hands of a very wealthy elite. Debt relief. He introduced measures for debt relief, adjusting repayment terms and reducing interest rates to ease the economic burdens on debtors and stabilize the Roman economy. The extension of citizenship. This is a very interesting one. So he laid the groundwork for extending Roman citizenship, aiming to integrate diverse populations within Rome's territory and ensure loyalty under a kind of uniform legal system. And lastly, judicial reform. So enacting reforms to the Roman court by increasing the number of praetorships and altering jury compositions to reduce senatorial influence and corruption, making the judicial process a bit more equitable. So very interesting. I think given some of the comments that you and I have made about these kind of backdoor dealings, the ability to help some and not others, while, at the same time, probably angering some of the, senatorial or like wealthy elite by creating this kind of more equitable, or at least an image of a more equitable society.
Yeah, you can see why the senators were not a big fan, right? The land redistribution, they're getting very, very rich and very, very powerful. And now someone's coming in and trying to be like, hey, we should start thinking about other people. And again, he's a populist, right? So he's trying to look out for the common man, at least from a political standpoint. And the one thing that you mentioned that I think might be, if not, like obviously his campaigns and everything like that, and his march on Rome and everything are such huge elements in his life, but to extend citizenship to the provincials is a massive, massive thing, because what they were running into issues with was Rome would conquer a province. They wouldn't give the people citizenship. And so they were still considered Spaniards, or they were still considered Greeks, or, wherever else they might be from. So what do they have to do with Rome? Why would I fight for Rome? I'm going to rebel the first chance I get, because I don't have the same rights as these rich guys back in Italy. Now that the Spaniards and the Africans all have Roman citizenship, or at least have a path to that, they feel Roman themselves. So they're going to rise up when emperors in the future or the consuls say they need troops. These people are going to rise up. They're actually going to look more towards, I'm part of this grand country, more than just, I am essentially an occupied person in an occupied territory. So it's a necessary step, but there's a lot of war and a lot of bloodshed that kind of got up to this point. And I think it's a really good move by Caesar, which will help him tremendously when he gets his proconsulship in Cisalpine Gaul and then moves into Gaul itself and incorporates that as a province. There's a lot of elements where he's like, using citizenship as a bargaining tool is probably one of the best cards that Rome can play. And 100%. They play it very well.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. And I think you just kind of touched on it, Paul. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't mention the Gallic Wars following his consulship, because it seems like, at least historically and like chronologically, this is a point at which is a massive kind of watershed moment for what's about to follow, with like kind of the deterioration of the first triumvirate and his ability, post launching a series of military campaigns in Gaul.
Yeah, I think it's important. So just to preface too, when we mention Cisalpine Gaul, that is basically northern Italy, just south of the Alps. And then Gaul is basically France today, with a little bit into Belgium and stuff like that. But the main thing is the Romans hate the Gauls. They've been fighting them for centuries. The Gauls have actually sacked Rome way back in the early days of the Republic. So there's a very deep hatred of the Gauls, and they're actually scared of them in some capacity. Like if you look at the Roman Republic at this time, they've conquered into the east and they've made it all the way to Syria. They've only got this slight sliver on the bottom part of France, but they haven't gone north. Part of that is the Gauls were very strong for a while, but they've also very feared, and there's not as much, ambition and maybe will to go north. That Caesar sees that as the perfect opportunity to kind of take this last kind of great frontier and really build this proper Mediterranean republic / empire.
Yeah. And I think, it is self-serving in many ways. He's able to not only increase his wealth, his prestige, and his military power, but it also brought vast territory, under Roman control, extending the republic's borders like as far as the English Channel and to the Rhine River, while also kind of creating some buffer space between the Germanic and Celtic threats that existed at the time. And
I think one thing too that's important to remember is he was at this time a proconsul. So after you were a consul, typically what you would do is go manage a province. That was kind of the next step. And you weren't allowed to take your army outside of the province unless you had approval from the Senate. And so Caesar's smart. He kind of pokes at some of these tribes that are just outside of his territory or wanting to move into the territory, really annoy them. They move into his territory to attack. And so he goes to the Senate. Well, I got to hunt these guys down. They just invaded. We got to go kick their butt. And they're like, sure, go for it. And as he starts to move his way through Gaul, they start to go, uh-oh, this guy's winning a lot of battles and he's becoming very, very popular. We should stop him at some point, right? And we'll get into that, I'm sure. But that's the key thing is he's moved outside of his province, and everything he does outside of the province needs to have senatorial approval. He can do what he wants in his province, but once he's outside of it, that's when things change a little bit. And that's where we talked about he likes to break the rules. And this is probably the worst rule that he's broken, because people can point to that and say, you're doing things with the Roman military that doesn't have approval of the Senate. That's treasonous. That's illegal. And, we want to bring you back to Rome to face trial, quite frankly.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like the role at which kind of the Gallic Wars played, because it's kind of like this crucial element in the dynamics of the first triumvirate. So he's able to get all this military success. He's increasing his wealth in Gaul significantly. And this in turn allows him to support the political ambitions of Pompey and Crassus while maintaining the alliance's balance of power. But to your point, his growing power also happens to kind of sow the seeds of jealousy and fear among some of his political rivals, including Pompey, who begins to see him as a threat to his own position in Rome. The vast army that Caesar's commanding in Gaul and his popularity with the soldiers and the Roman populace he starts seeing it as a direct challenge to the Senate and this kind of traditional Republican order that the Senate wants to maintain.
Yeah, and for someone who's just conquered all of France, he's won a great battle at the city of Alesia and captured the head of the Gallic armies. And just real quickly on that, I really love that battle, because for those who don't know, basically the head of the Gallic armies is in a city, and what Caesar does is he builds a wall around the city so nobody can escape, and he can kind of keep his troops outside of that wall and really hold them down until they have to surrender because they don't have enough food. But then he gets word that there's a relief army coming. So now he's going to be hit on both sides. He's got this army in the city that he's trying to hold, and then this 30,000 troop Gallic force coming from the rear. So what does he do? Instead of breaking the siege and going attacking, he builds another wall. And so now he's essentially walled himself in on both sides, fighting on two sides. And naturally, with Caesar being the brilliant commander that he is, he's able to smash the invading army that's coming from the rear with his cavalry. They break away. Then the people in the city eventually surrender, and he's able to capture the head of the Gallic army and bring him back to Rome in chains, which is this huge moment because, think about how people got information back then. You're some guy who shows up at the front of the Roman city, walks to the gates with some bearded guy with face paint on and who looks completely foreign with all these riches. People are going to go crazy for this, right? This is such a huge moment. So all of this, it makes him so popular. And like you said, Pompey being a little bit more conservative, the Senate being very, very worried because he's already done all these things to drop their wealth down. Now he's got all this great power. He's conquered all of France. He's now actually gone into Britain as well and done some work there and established a bit of a Roman presence. This guy is king of Rome at this point, even though, that's the last thing he wants to be called. But from the eyes of the people are starting to think, there's something to this guy, right? So it's a very, very scary place to be for the Senate because they just saw what Sulla did. And I'm sure they're all saying, well, we just have a Sulla on our hands, but maybe even worse this time.
It's such a delicate balance, right? And I think that's really at this point of the biography, as I was reading, it's really, really obvious that these very fine-tunedly balanced relationships relationships and dynamics across, the triumvirate, but like the Roman Republic and the Senate is all at play here, with any kind of movement or decision potentially being kind of like, the thing that breaks all of it. And that's why this part is so interesting. So like to your point, the campaigns in Gaul draw to a close, and this delicate balance of the first triumvirate begin to unravel. And I think the two major components is Crassus's death in the Parthenian campaign in 53 BC and the weakening personal ties between Caesar and Pompey, which is exacerbated by the death of Caesar's daughter Julia, who was Pompey's wife, led to these kind of increasing tensions, which eventually would culminate in his, fateful decision to cross the Rubicon in 49 BC.
And that's the famous play, right? Is crossing the Rubicon. What does that actually mean? Well, like I mentioned earlier, you can't take your army outside of your province without senatorial approval. Now, he's taking it into enemy territory, but the Rubicon is the southern border of Cisalpine Gaul into Italia proper. And now he's crossed that. He's brought his provincial army into Roman lands, senatorial lands, the lands of, true Rome. It's an unbelievably shocking decision for a lot of people, because he easily could have said, you know what, I'm going to come back to Rome and I'll face, some trials, and we'll see where it goes. And maybe I live a life, I can go retire after I've done all these great things. But from what we know about Caesar, he's not doing that. Pompey also could have said, look, we're not going to worry about any of this stuff. Come on back. We'll get you back into kind of the thick of things. We're not going to try you. We're going to pardon you of these things and we'll start clean. But again, you have these two men who are very ambitious and understand what it means to do that, because now you've given this other person this leg to stand on. And then I'm sure the senators are not happy about having Caesar at all come back. And so in some cases, Julius Caesar's hands are a little bit tied, that he knows that, hey, he might be even be killed if he comes back, right?
Yep.
And so he's kind of like, well, what do I got to lose? But man, is it a bold move, right? Because Sulla may have done it before, but there's another element to this where you're also going against, potentially fighting against Pompey, one of your greatest friends. And then, maybe if there's another general that's on the same level as you, Pompey's pretty darn close. So it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be a good time for Rome, but hey, it happens and it kickstarts, one of the great civil wars of history.
Yeah. And maybe just as like a closing sentiment for this part of Julius Caesar, I think many of us have probably heard of the phrase crossing of the Rubicon, and I've heard it, but I didn't really understand kind of the magnitude and weight of it. But kind of the symbolism behind this sentiment, it's almost become synonymous with taking a decisive, irreversible step, like you're closing that door, there's no coming back from it. And reportedly, Caesar is on record, quote unquote, for saying, well, we'll see how good my Latin is after this. Alia iacta est, the die is cast, as he crossed the river, signaling his commitment to confront his political enemies and asserting his refusal to submit to the Senate's demands of disbanding his army.
It's a perfect kind of way to bring it together. And even if you said it or not, the die is cast.
It's it's so good.
This is it. Like it's only forward from here. It's death or victory. And again, what's more Roman than that, right? Death or victory. That's just the way they've been, going about life for so long. But instead of, going towards an enemy, it's, coming at yourself and fighting against your fellow Romans, which was completely shocking thought for many, many Romans for so long. And unfortunately now becomes more of a norm than an outlier in that story. But yeah, here we go, right? He's crossed the Rubicon. A civil war is about to begin, and we'll touch on that next time, because this isn't just a little skirmish in Italy against Pompey where he becomes victorious. He goes all over the Mediterranean before he comes back to Rome. There's a lot to cover there, and it's a really fascinating story. And we see the likes of Mark Antony and Cleopatra and all these other great ancient historical figures play a really key role in the ultimate fate of Julius Caesar.
It's going to be an exciting part 2.
Yes, definitely. So definitely stay tuned for that. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with part 2, but hope everybody enjoyed part 1. And we'll see you all next time for the conclusion of this insane, crazy, almost mythological or story, whatever you want to call it. But yeah, it's quite the ending.
Awesome. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the History in Motion podcast. If you enjoyed our journey through time, please subscribe, rate us, and share the podcast with friends. Your support helps keep history alive. Until next time.